What is your connection with the Alley Theater?
Many years ago, I was employed there.
Okay.
I was a business manager for 4 years, and prior to that, even at the old alley before the downtown building,
The
I
fan
was there
factory?
for a year. Yep, the
Okay.
abandoned fan factory, yes.
And are you still an active member or contributor to the Alley Theater?
No,
Okay.
no. I mean, attend occasionally, but that's the extent of it.
Okay. What do you know about the history of the Alley Theater, and would you say that the history of the theater has impacted the way it is viewed here in Houston?
Sure. I'm fairly familiar with its early history, obviously, less about its operations and so forth since then.
Okay.
But yeah, I lived a lot of that history
Okay. Okay.
and more importantly, knew and worked with people who were the founders and pioneers of it.
Okay, that's amazing. Can you recall the experience of first being introduced or visiting the Alley Theater?
Sure. You want to hear it?
Yes, I do.
No, it was when I came down to work here, or at least to be interviewed for it, and that would have been in 1966.
Okay.
So I had no idea what to expect. I remember flying down here and landing in one of the worst rains imaginable, and that was my introduction to Houston. And then meeting with Nina Vance and other people the next day, and spent a couple of days here, and then went back up to Washington, where I was then working, and then returned in a couple of months back to here and spent a year.
Okay. Okay. And what aspects has this theater changed your life, and has it changed the way you view the arts and entertainment industry?
Well, at the time, that was my life.
Okay.
That was what I did. I have not worked in arts administration since 1977,
Okay, it's been a while.
and I think it had a quite profound effect upon me in many ways. We made a lot of friends. We still have. But it was the type of thing that, for me, was almost similar, I think, to maybe someone who does a Peace Corps, or maybe it was a defrocked priest or something of the sort. I'm glad to have done it.
Yes.
Don't regret it at all, but never wanted to be a part of it again.
Okay. Okay. Is there a reason why?
It's a tough field, particularly as with so many nonprofit things, one's just constantly scrounging and begging for money.
Okay. Okay. I understand.
And it's and I was in the position essentially of having to be the paymaster and worry about that. My last arts job was with a fellow who, as a matter of fact, just died recently, and I loved him like a brother. But I said, I think I'll murder him if I have to work with him anymore. And it wasn't, I think, so much his fault as it was just the way he was. He had many levels of reality, but for him, what most of us would think as the most basic reality of finances and all the rest of it, that was as nothing to him. It was
Okay.
more about bells and spangles and all the rest of it. And it was a good time to leave.
Okay, I understand. Why do you think the Alley Theater is an important part of the Houston community?
And that, by the way, was not at Alley Theater. That was at another arts organization.
Oh, okay, okay. So the fellow that died worked with you in a different organization?
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
He was the founder and longtime producer of Theater Under the Stars,
Oh, okay, okay.
where I was also business manager.
Okay, so you worked at several different like theaters or like...
Yeah, not all
organization.
here, but in different places.
Okay, okay. Why do you think the Alley Theater is an important part of the Houston community? If you do think this.
Sure. Well, not only Houston community, but nationally. It is has been, since its founding, a pioneer in what was called the American Resident Professional Theater movement. And although it's changed and evolved, and of course grown enormously through the years, it remains so. and has been nationally recognized, and for people in the business and the industry, known very, very well for that. So I think anytime you have a kind of anchor in any field, it's important to the city in which it exists, whether that would be in Houston or in Chicago or in Wichita or anywhere else. We've every reason, I think, to be proud of it.
Yes.
And of course, there are other arts organizations in the city that are they're kind of the anchors.
Okay.
And many other companies, smaller organizations and producing organizations, are needed, and they serve very valuable functions, but they don't replace the big anchor company.
Yes. Yes. How different do you think Houston would be without the Alley Theater? Do you think the art industry would change dramatically since we don't have
Sure.
like that big anchor?
Sure. Just as we would be not only a less culturally rich city, but we would be differently regarded elsewhere if we didn't have the Grand Opera, the symphony,
Yes.
if we didn't have museums and a great number of other things. So I think it's impossible to separate the importance of something as it exists locally
Yes.
from what it means to others outside the local community too.
Yes. Yes.
I think the two are inseparable.
Yes. I do understand. How have you seen the Alley Theater grow? Are there any specific like things that you like noticed, like besides like the building? Like, have you seen it grow? And, like, how many plays it has?
Well, I was there almost at the beginning of the new building downtown.
Okay.
I came at the beginning of the second year of that season. Interesting story to that I don't know how far you want to get into, but if time permits, I can tell you that it was a remarkable time and very little known now. Almost nothing written about it, and most people who lived and survived that time are no longer alive. But my memories of it are quite vivid.
Okay.
But and that would have been in 1969.
Okay.
But the building itself, particularly after the first great flood, and it suffered so much damage, was substantially changed, remodeled, offices replaced, all the rest of it. And now, of course, it's having to go through exactly the same thing again.
Yes.
If anything, even worse.
Yes. What was your
But
reaction?
they also, just financially and in terms of, not so much in terms of numbers of productions, but in terms of scope and activity,
Yes.
it's continued to grow.
Yes, yes. It has a very big scope here in the Houston community, and like it's kind of like Broadway for Houston. What was your reaction once you heard or saw that the Alley Theater was affected by Harvey? And did you have any certain like?
It was sickening because although I no longer live and work in that kind of milieu, that community, all I could think of is there, but for the grace of, go I. The same problems that the organization has now could have been mine decades ago.
Yes. Were you afraid that the impact of the damages would have, were you afraid of the impact that damages would have on the art scene in Houston because of the absence of the theater, since they weren't showing any plays and they might not show the Christmas play?
The organization as a producing entity had already established that it could, because it did as a result of the earlier storm, at least temporarily find another place to produce.
Yes.
And for things to be seen. So that wouldn't surprise me. But again, just a sickening feeling of so much work, so much effort, so much commitment and contributed support almost being lost and have to be regained entirely again. That produces nausea
Yes.
from a person who, again, decades removed from the most active involvement, but still feels the pain.
Yes, yes. Do you know exactly how the theater was affected by the flooding? Like, do you know exactly like what parts of the theater was affected or how it was affected?
Only generally.
Okay.
I've not, in fact, I've not been in the building since Harvey.
Okay.
I was very familiar with it before. I could almost draw a floor plan of what everything like was before the first storm. And I then got a chance to tour it pretty fully after the first storm.
Okay.
And so, to that degree, exact, yes, but in terms of present tense, no.
Okay. Okay. What would you
Excuse
say?
me, I know that my wife
Yes.
attended this past week, attended the first production done back in the new building,
Okay.
The Christmas Carol, and I asked her, I said, what was it like for an audience? Because I delivered her there that night. And when you see porta-cans lined up on the street outside the building, you just don't have a real good feeling
Yes.
about what that experience will be like. Now, she was not in the downstairs theater,
Okay.
but evidently the creature comforts and from an audience experience perception, it's as if nothing happened. I think that's miraculous.
That is,
Now, who knows what miracles have to take place out of
Oh, yeah.
sight in order to create that impression
Yes.
for the performance and all the rest of it.
Yes. What would you say was the biggest consequence or effect of the theater being closed for this period of time? Or do you think there was no consequence of it being closed since they found another place?
Oh, sure. Producing almost immediately thereafter over at U of H. Great inconvenience, to be sure. But as a practical matter, no more than that for the company. Now, the problems of rebuilding and essentially refinancing millions of dollars, most of it uninsured. That's what's sickening.
Yes, of course. They lost all the props and all the downtown area.
As did, by the way, if you may or may not know, UHD's own theater.
Yes.
All right.
Do you think the community will welcome the Alley Theater back when they open for the showing of A Christmas Carol? Well, they already opened it. But
Already have.
do you
Already
think-
have. Going right on.
Do you think the audience or like the community has welcomed them back the same amount?
Oh, sure. My perception is that similar to the Grand Opera, and by the way, that's even a more dramatic story, as you probably are aware, because they're producing in circumstances that were never intended for that art form at all. But my understanding is that all of the major arts organizations are experiencing a downturn in what was projected revenue. But I don't think that has to do with the community's,
Perception.
any sort of reevaluation or any lessening of respect. It's just tightened times for a lot of businesses, as you would be aware.
Okay. Do you know any information about the flooding, like who's paying for like the rebuilding of the theater, or do you know like any like information like that? Like
None in particular.
Okay.
Nothing more than what's been widely published and spoken of.
okay. Those are all the questions that I have. Would you like to say any extra information or anything that you would like to add?
I don't know how far you want to go, or do you have any interest in something that what I mentioned was extraordinarily important in the theater's history that is not known at all now and has never, to my knowledge, been even written about?
Yeah, go ahead.
You'd have a scoop?
Go
Is
ahead.
that right? The new building,
You can talk about it.
the new building, I keep saying the new building, just in its present location, was a major, major step, and was probably only possible because of the assistance of the Ford Foundation, which had the foundation itself affected enormously cultural organizations all over the country, not only in the performing arts, but visual as well. And that was before there was even a National Arts Endowment. The Ford Foundation was the major driving force. And it was really one man who was in charge of its Arts and Humanities division, who was not an artist himself. He had been an English professor and different things, and he'd been in the Navy and so forth, and he got out, and the Ford Foundation hired him. His name was W. McNeill Lowry. And the reason I mention that is because when he died, there were at least 4 different institutions in this city that owed their very existence in anything like the scope that they are now to Mac Lowry. And there wasn't a word written about it in the Houston newspaper, no coverage at all. How quickly we forget in life. But what he did with Alley Theater all the way back to sometime in the mid-50s is to walk into the old alley, the fan factory that you're talking about, and say, if you'd like, I can try to recruit you here in town, a board of directors, and we'll build you a downtown building. Now, it won't be the foundation entirely, but the foundation will provide the seed for all of that and operating subsidy for the first 10 years. And Mac Lowry personally went and called on people who'd never even been in the little old theater before, had no interest, no anything. And with, I think, just the grandest appeal that could ever be made, he went to these major figures in Houston and said, I'd like you to make Alley Theater third in your life. Well, of course, that invites the question, what are the other 2? And of course, then he, knowing he was dealing with good conservative old Texans, he said, well, first, of course, would be your family. He said, second would be your business interests, your work involvement here. He said, I'd like you to make the alley third. He said, it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of commitment on your part, but it's worth it. His batting average was very high, and he assembled real heavyweights who, as I say, had had no involvement or particular interest in the theater as an art form or any of the rest of it. But he did all that for Nina Vance. And the relationship between Nina and Mac Lowry was very close. In no way improperly so, but it was just that he trusted her so much that later, many years later, following his death and the donation of his papers to the University of Illinois, where he had been both a student and on a faculty for some years, the archive are something like 62 boxes of all of his papers from the Ford Foundation and all the time. And I may have been one of the only handful of people, but in traveling through central Illinois, I convinced my wife to let me off there at the archives, and I spent a full day, 9 hours, just pouring through all of his papers relating to Houston and to other arts organizations that I'd worked with before. And to realize this man was a titan and had personal letters from Leonard Bernstein and major architects and all the rest of it. And that they were all just sitting there in that file, largely forgotten about now. And I think it a great pity. All right, back to 1968. The alley opened in the downtown building in the fall. And significantly overstaffed. No one quite knew how to handle all of that. Technicians who were wildly overworked, and so much so that they thought this would be the end of their lives almost unless they got some kind of help. They sought the help of the local stagehands union, because the alley had been a non-union stagehands house. It had always had relationships with Actors' Equity the Performers Union, they went out on strike. And there were picket lines outside and so forth, people having to go to plays, crossing picket lines and such. And that 10-year operating subsidy that I described was called on for what was meant to be the last 5 years of it, just to get the building up and opened and so forth. So some of that safety pillow that the alley was resting on at the time had already been taken away. But when I came, there was hardly even a set of books at the place. From a business perspective, it hadn't quite reached the level of professionalism that it needed to. And it was my misfortune to have to go to Miss Vance and other top people, and also I inherited all the contact with the board of directors and had to tell them that all of the season ticket money for what had been a subscription house, we had over 15,000 subscribers, all of that had been spent before the first play would be done. That's called living off your deferred revenue in accounting terms. It means you've taken in money you haven't yet earned, and ideally, of course, you then draw on it only on a proportionate basis as you would be spending it. We hadn't done that. And it was my unhappy duty to try to face that and to realize that we wouldn't be able to finish the season. The theater was going to have to close then. There was just no way that single ticket revenue or so-called earned income would be able to sustain it, and there had never been an operating annual fund drive. And so in company with dear Iris Siff, a woman who had been there a long time and had other administrative functions, the two of us went up to New York twice and met with McLowry in his office, and that man went out on a real limb and dispersed and distributed all of the remaining subsidy so that we had no other operating subsidy from the foundation, but he bought the opportunity for us to mount our first major development fund drive here locally. But if he hadn't done that, you can't do that. The old thing of you have to be desperate to raise money. No, you don't. To raise big amounts of money, you have to be stable enough to do it, because no one's interested in just tossing bad money after bad.
Yes.
And that was not widely known. In fact, it was not known at all. We didn't go out of our way locally here to make that known. Our board knew about it and so forth, but I think every single member of that board of directors of the time, and certainly of the executive committee that I dealt with, every one of them is long since dead. Do you know the last line of Moby Dick?
No. What is the last line?
Do you know the first line of Moby Dick?
No.
All right. The first line is "Call me Ishmael." You'll have to go to a literature class somewhere to find out how significant that is. It's one of the most famous first few words that open any American novel, and of course some people would say it is arguably the greatest American novel ever written. All right. The last line of Moby Dick is, "And I alone am lived to tell the tale." And I feel that's what I'm saying about those days of alley theater, because there's practically no one who survived those times. There's only one employee presently at the alley who was there during that time. He's still there. And they've made, I think, efforts to get rid of him, and he's fought it off, and he's remained, partly because of the support of board members who then knew about what he had done and how crucial he was to. He was essentially the box office and subscription manager. He remains, and that's the only person. One by one, all of the others at one time or another left, died, or otherwise are no longer about.
That's amazing. That was an amazing story.
Well, that's probably more than your project needs to know or wants to know. But it's hard to write history assuming it only happened in the last year.
Yes.
Without realizing that everything, whether it's government or anything else, always the present, whenever it is, based upon the past and the past upon its past, and so on.
Yes.
No, that's amazing. Now we have it recorded, so
Goodness.
Actually, I have two more questions, actually.
Hit it. And I am going to have to leave very shortly.
It's quick. So how would you say the people who go into the Alley Theater to look at the plays, how would you say people take the spirit of the Alley Theater with them to their own communities around? Because you said it's important nationally, so how do you think people take it?
It is. There are similar companies elsewhere, but I think there's a recognition among anyone from say Louisville, Kentucky, that has a fine Actors Theater of Louisville, I think is the name of it. The more they know of that, the more they're also aware that movement began with Alley Theater and Arena Stage in Washington almost simultaneously. A few years later, the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. So they were the pioneers. And I think the Alley's reputation as a pioneer in its particular field of arts will always remain.
Mm-hmm.